Nearly 79 years ago, a boy just shy of 4 years old was cycling with his older brother along a sidewalk in Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan, when an unfamiliar woman approached, lured him with candy, took his hand, and vanished with him in the middle of the day as though they'd never existed. With New York police unable to uncover any leads, suspicion turned toward the children's biological mother, who had recently gone through a contentious separation from the boy's father shortly before the disappearance. Decades passed without resolution. The original case file was lost in a station fire, and the father eventually died still clinging to the belief, one nobody else shared, that his son was alive somewhere. But 74 years later, when a Long Island woman used an at-home DNA kit simply to tell her triplets apart, the results appended everything she believed about her father's origins, linking her to a 79-year-old man in Florida who had spent his life searching for a younger brother taken in 1945. This is the account of Gerald Jerry Martin, the boy abducted from a New York street who spent all 76 years of his life under a false identity, raised by people who weren't his biological parents, unaware of his true origins until an inexpensive genetic test exposed a secret his extended family had kept hidden for nearly 100 years. The summer of 1945 arrived in New York with typical northeastern humidity, the kind of oppressive heat that radiated up from pavement and settled between the crowded tenement buildings of Manhattan. The war in Europe had concluded 2 months prior with Germany's May surrender, and soldiers were gradually returning home, though the Pacific conflict continued, even as its end felt increasingly close. Amid this atmosphere, Hell's Kitchen on Manhattan's west side was among the city's most densely populated neighborhoods, filled with red brick tenements packed tightly together, where children filled the sidewalks from morning until dusk. The Martin family lived in a cramped apartment within this bustling, working-class Irish community that relied on jobs at the nearby Hudson River docks, where residents knew each other well and neighbors kept a natural, informal watch over one another. Superficially, they resembled any other working-class Hell's Kitchen family of the era, but beneath the surface was a fractured marriage with unresolved tension. Gerald, known as Jerry, was the younger son, not quite 4, with his birthday only 2 days off, though few details about him were ever documented, since he disappeared before having much of a personal history. His father, Harold Martin, worked as a laborer. Harold and Nancy, the children's mother, had split, and it hadn't ended peacefully. Resentment lingered between them. Harold was now living with another woman and had a 1-year-old daughter named Mary with her. The family structure was in flux, strained, and unresolved. Jerry's older brother, 6-year-old Tommy, was the firstborn. This was also an era before the modern concept of stranger danger existed. Children playing unsupervised outdoors was entirely ordinary, and nobody imagined harm could come to them in broad daylight within their own neighborhood. On the afternoon of July 9, 1945, Tommy, 6, and Jerry, not quite 4, were riding their bikes near home as usual, 2 brothers, 2 small bicycles, laughter amid the crowded streets. A stranger, a woman, approached and offered them candy. Tommy, being older, sensed something was off and declined. Jerry, too young to recognize danger, couldn't resist and accepted. He had no capacity yet to register the situation as threatening. The woman took his hand and told Tommy to wait, promising they'd return shortly. Tommy waited. Jerry never came back. There was no violence, no struggle, no outcry, nothing that would have seemed alarming to onlookers. Just a woman walking hand in hand with a child down a New York street in daylight, nothing that would raise suspicion. That afternoon was the last time anyone saw Jerry Martin, just 2 days before what would have been his 4th birthday. When Jerry failed to return, Tommy rushed home and told his father. Harold, panicked, ran outside searching the streets and questioning neighbors, but no one had witnessed or heard anything unusual. Police were contacted, setting off a search that would ultimately stretch on for 74 years. That same night, Harold went to the local police precinct to report his son missing, and officers filed a report for Gerald Jerry Martin. The only witness was 6-year-old Tommy, who described what happened, a strange woman offering candy, taking Jerry's hand, and saying they'd return soon. But when investigators pushed for further details, the woman's appearance, age, clothing, hair color, or which direction they'd gone, Tommy couldn't answer. He was, after all, only 6 years old, and the trail went cold from there. He had no capacity to accurately recall or describe the physical features of an adult he'd only encountered briefly on the sidewalk. That vague, incomplete account from a young child was the entirety of what police had to work with that night. No suspect description, no direction of travel, nothing concrete. In the days that followed, officers canvassed every apartment near the site of the disappearance, questioning neighbors on every floor, street vendors, mothers out with strollers, and dock workers heading home from their shifts along the Hudson. The response was consistently the same: Nobody had noticed anything out of the ordinary, since a woman walking hand in hand with a child through Hell's Kitchen on a summer day wasn't unusual at all. This was 1945. There were no street cameras, no Amber Alert system, which wouldn't exist until decades later, no National Crime Information Center database, established in 1967, no DNA testing technology, no internet, and no cell phones. Investigators had almost nothing to go on beyond a young child's fragmented recollection. In missing child cases, suspicion typically falls first on family members, especially a parent involved in a contentious separation, often the parent without custody. The Martin family fit that pattern closely. Harold and Nancy's split had been acrimonious. Harold was cohabiting with a new partner and their daughter, and the boys lived with Harold rather than their mother. As the biological mother separated from her sons, Nancy had an obvious potential motive, reclaiming her child and striking back at her ex-husband. She was repeatedly interrogated about her location and activities on July 9th, and though she maintained her innocence and her family corroborated her account, investigators ultimately ruled her out as a suspect. With Nancy cleared, police had nothing left, no alternate suspect, no evidence, just a vanished child in a city of 8 million people, as though he'd never existed. In the weeks that followed, Harold visited the Hell's Kitchen police station almost daily, asking for updates and consistently hearing there was nothing new. Weeks became months, months became years, and Harold kept coming back, less frequently over time, but still persistently, recognized on sight by officers, and always leaving without answers. Family members later described him as permanently altered by that day, prone to tears, reluctant to discuss Jerry openly, yet clearly haunted by his son's absence. He went on to build a life, remarrying and having 2 more children, but part of him remained fixed on that afternoon. Near the end of his life, on his deathbed, he repeated what he'd maintained for years, a conviction that Jerry was still alive somewhere. His family assumed this was wishful thinking born of grief rather than genuine belief, and he died still holding on to that certainty. After Harold's death, Tommy carried on the search alone, the memory of that day never fading, the bicycles, the stranger's offer of candy, his brother walking off with her, and the endless waiting that followed. That memory stayed with him for 74 years, from childhood in Hell's Kitchen to his later years as a retired man in Florida, sustained only by a thin hope of eventually finding his brother. His half-sister Mary also carried the weight of the story, and the family gradually resigned themselves to the likelihood that Jerry would never be found. Time moved forward. In 1982, the Missing Children's Act was signed into law, far too late to help in Jerry's case. At some point, the original police case file was destroyed, reportedly in a fire, leaving only a brief newspaper clipping in the New York Daily News archive as evidence the abduction had even occurred. Eventually, everyone connected to the case passed away, and any remaining leads disappeared. The case wasn't just cold, it was effectively erased by time. It might have remained that way permanently if not for a saliva sample submitted to a lab in California in 2017. Understanding how Jerry could vanish for 74 years without detection requires understanding how limited child protection systems were in mid-20th century America. Child abductions were more common than commonly believed, frequently motivated not by ransom but by a desire to simply have a child. Since the 1920s, law enforcement had recognized a pattern. Women unable to conceive, facing pressure from spouses or society, sometimes resorted to kidnapping children to raise as their own, occasionally going so far as faking pregnancies, complete with weight gain and prepared cover stories. Author Paula Fass, who wrote about child abduction history in America, described how black market adoption networks were also responsible for many disappearances in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Demand for children was so high that even medical professionals sometimes participated despite the professional risk, while unmarried mothers faced pressure to give up their infants. And those unable to obtain a child through these networks sometimes took one directly. What made such cases nearly undetectable was the administrative landscape of the era. Before 1946, birth records weren't tracked systematically nationwide, contained minimal information, and could be issued by almost anyone with relevant authority. Home births remained common, and prior to World War II, as many as 200,000 children annually were born in the U.S. without any birth certificate at all. Hospital practices weren't much more secure. Infant identification bans were uncommon and oversight was minimal. This meant an abducted child could easily be issued a fraudulent birth certificate with a new name, birth date, and parentage, becoming an entirely different person on paper, with no databases or DNA technology available to catch the discrepancy. Most such cases went permanently undetected, adoptive families kept quiet, children were too young to remember their origins, and relatives accepted whatever explanation they were given without investigating further. Fast noted that historically, discovery was exceedingly rare, but the emergence of consumer DNA testing in the 2010s began exposing decades-old secrets, cases 40, 50, even 70 years old, unraveled by a cheek swab and genetic matching software. It raises an open question of how many people might unknowingly be living under identities that were never truly theirs. Jerry Martin turned out to be one of them. The boy who disappeared from Hell's Kitchen resurfaced a short ferry ride away in Staten Island under the name Richard Rocco Palladeiso, given a different birth date and a new set of parents entirely. According to his birth certificate, Richard was born May 31, 1943, in Staten Island to Isabel and Angelo Palladeiso, yet Jerry had actually been born in 1941, meaning if Richard truly was Jerry, someone had falsified his age by 2 years. Isabel, over 40 at the time with 2 grown daughters from a previous relationship but no children with Angelo, and Angelo, a World War II veteran who'd returned to Staten Island in September 1945, exactly 2 months after Jerry's abduction, both factored into the mystery surrounding his true origins. When Angelo returned home after 2 years away, he found a child already there, one he was told was his own son. The unresolved question that lingers is how a nearly 4-year-old, who could already speak, knew his own name, remembered his brother Tommy, and knew he'd lived in Hell's Kitchen, could have his identity erased so completely and become Richard, supposedly age 2, son of Isabel. It's possible that young children's memories are more malleable than assumed, that without anyone referencing the past or using his real name, his mind simply adapted to the new reality. Alternatively, he may have remembered and protested, only to be silenced. What's documented is that Richard grew up in an emotionally cold household. Isabel was strict, even forbidding him from speaking at the dinner table, shutting down anything he tried to say. Years afterward, when Richard's daughter contacted a cousin, the son of his uncle Jack Palladeiso, she learned something startling. The extended family had always known Richard wasn't a biological Palladeiso. Everyone was aware except Richard himself. However, the family's version of events wasn't about kidnapping at all. Family lore held that Helen Han, a live-in babysitter, was actually his biological mother, that Isabel had once run a brothel, that Helen had been one of the women there, and that Richard's biological father was a local criminal figure, with Richard adopted because Helen was an unmarried mother. This was the accepted family narrative, and nobody questioned it further. When Richard was 12, Isabel died, and he went to live with his uncle, Giacomo Jack Palladeiso, staying until high school graduation before leaving and largely severing ties with the family. No one made an effort to maintain the relationship or reach out, a distance that, in hindsight, likely stemmed from the family's unspoken awareness that he wasn't truly one of them, creating a barrier Richard sensed without understanding. Richard eventually married and had 3 daughters, twins Audrey and Cynthia, and a younger daughter, Stephanie. Helen Han remained part of the household for years, dying when the twins were 10, taking whatever she knew to her grave. Richard took pride in his presumed Italian heritage, which had become central to his identity, and he never suspected the truth. Still, his daughters would later recognize certain signs. He dealt with bipolar disorder and chronic anxiety, and though warm and funny, he also carried a quiet, unexplained emotional distance from his family. After Angelo died when Richard was 27, all contact with the Palladeiso family ended completely, with no outreach in either direction. Richard died in 2017 at age 76, and his children mourned him as their father, Richard Palladeiso. But 2 years later, his daughters would discover he was actually Gerald Jerry Martin, abducted from a Manhattan sidewalk at not quite 4 years old in July 1945. He'd spent 76 years under a false name, incorrect birth date, and with parents who weren't biologically his, never knowing about his brother Tommy who searched for him, never learning that his biological father Harold died grieving him, and never knowing his biological mother Nancy had been wrongly suspected and lived under that cloud for the rest of her life. The narrative suggests that the greater tragedy isn't necessarily dying young, but living an entire lifetime without knowing your true identity, and this secret might have stayed buried permanently if not for a 23andMe test. In 2017, Audrey Bell, 51, from Long Island, purchased a 23andMe kit for an unrelated reason. She wanted to determine which of her triplets were identical versus fraternal. There was no investigative intent behind it. She submitted her sample and received results 6 weeks later confirming the triplets' relationships as expected. But the ancestry portion of her results was odd. It indicated Southern European heritage but showed 0 Italian ancestry, despite her father's lifelong pride in his Italian and Irish background, complete with Italian cooking and family stories tied to the Palladeiso name. Audrey shared this discrepancy with her twin Cynthia McFadden and younger sister Stephanie. All three were puzzled but didn't pursue it further. Their father had recently died, so they couldn't ask him directly, and they assumed it might simply be a testing inaccuracy. 2 years later, in late 2019, Cynthia took her own 23andMe test, and this time the results were impossible to dismiss. She also showed no Italian ancestry, instead showing Irish, Scottish, and Spanish heritage. Identical results across 2 separate tests from twin sisters ruled out simple error. The sisters decided to verify further by asking a close living relative, cousin Richard Palladeiso, son of Uncle Jack, to also test. If their father had truly been a biological Palladeiso, they should share a meaningful percentage of DNA with this cousin. The results confirmed their suspicions: no genetic relation whatsoever. This established 3 undeniable facts: no Italian ancestry, no genetic connection to the Palladeiso family, and clear evidence their father wasn't who he'd believed himself to be. Initially, the sisters wondered if their father might have been the product of an affair. Perhaps Isabel had a secret relationship and Angelo wasn't his biological father. But the real breakthrough came unexpectedly. When Cynthia enabled 23andMe's DNA relatives feature, which surfaces genetic matches within the platform's database, an unfamiliar name appeared: Tom Martin, 79, from Florida, sharing 22% DNA with her, a percentage consistent with an uncle-niece or grandparent-grandchild relationship. Cynthia had never heard this name before. She told Audrey to activate the same feature, and Audrey got an identical match with Tom Martin at the same percentage. Both twins were connected to this unknown man in Florida. Initially they wondered if Tommy might be an unknown grandfather, but the math didn't work. At 79, he was too young to be grandfather to 2 53-year-old women, placing him instead in the generation of an uncle. The sisters reached out to Tommy through 23andMe's messaging system, and his response changed everything. Tommy hadn't taken the test out of genealogical curiosity. He'd done it specifically to search for his younger brother, Gerald "Jerry" Martin, abducted from a Manhattan street on July 9, 1945, 74 years prior. Tommy recounted the full story: the 2 brothers biking near home, a stranger offering candy, Jerry leaving with her, Tommy waiting in vain, their father Harold's lifelong search and repeated visits to the police station, and his eventual death still believing his son was alive. Tommy had continued that search himself, and now, at 79, after 74 years, 23andMe had revealed that 3 women in Long Island were his biological nieces. His half-sister Mary also got involved, sharing memories of Harold's deathbed conviction. The sisters now faced an enormous question: had their father, Richard Palladeiso, actually been Jerry Martin all along? The evidence strongly pointed to yes: a DNA match with Tommy at precisely the ratio expected for an uncle-niece relationship, no genetic tie to the Palladeiso family, and ancestry results showing Irish and Scottish heritage matching the Martin family's background. The chronology lined up neatly. Jerry vanished in July 1945, and Angelo returned from military service that September. Yet there was a discrepancy too. Richard's birth certificate listed 1943, while Jerry was born in 1941, a 2-year gap. If Richard truly was Jerry, someone had misrepresented his age. Still, it remained possible that Richard was unrelated and that the DNA connection had some other explanation. Researcher Paula Fass pointed out this case was atypical, since abductions of this kind usually targeted infants rather than nearly 4-year-olds, since a child that age could already speak, knew his identity, and would be far harder to convince of a new one than a newborn. That said, pre-1946 birth certificates were simple to falsify, and Isabel may not have known the child's actual age when she brought him home, and a young child's memories, especially without any reminders of the past or use of his original name, could plausibly fade or be overwritten. The sisters couldn't establish absolute proof, but every clue pointed toward the same conclusion, and further digging into the Palladeiso family revealed an even more troubling picture. Continuing their investigation, the sisters contacted Uncle Jack Palladeiso's son, Richard's cousin and the last relative with clear memories of the family, who confirmed that Richard wasn't biologically related to Isabel and Angelo. More shocking was learning that this had been common knowledge throughout the family. Uncle Jack, the cousins, everyone, except Richard himself, who lived his entire life unaware while those around him maintained a silence. Yet the family's own explanation wasn't about abduction. Family law held that the live-in babysitter, Helen Han, was Richard's actual biological mother, that Isabel ran a brothel, that Helen was one of the women working there, and that Richard's father was a local criminal, with the adoption explained by Helen being unmarried. This was accepted without question by the family, but the sisters weren't satisfied and dug further. Was this the truth, or a cover story concealing something worse? One detail the Helen's story failed to account for was the DNA. the sisters shared 22% of their genetic material with Tommy Martin, indicating a full sibling relationship between Richard and Tommy, not a distant or unrelated connection. This meant Richard was Tommy's actual brother, not the child of Helen Hahn and some unnamed criminal. That blood relationship contradicted the family's cover story entirely, and if Richard truly was Tommy's brother, that meant Richard was, in fact, Jerry Martin. The sisters pieced together a timeline. Angelo served roughly 2 years abroad while Isabel remained in Staten Island, over 40 and already the mother of 2 adult daughters from a prior relationship. It's possible she either became pregnant and lost the child, or fabricated a pregnancy entirely through letters sent to Angelo overseas, a lie that would have been increasingly difficult to reverse as the war continued. When Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Angelo's return became imminent, Isabel would have needed to produce a child to support her claim. That July, 2 months before his return, Jerry was taken from a Hell's Kitchen sidewalk, just a short ferry trip from Staten Island. When Angelo arrived home in September 1945 after 2 years away, he found a child waiting. One his wife told him was their 2-year-old son, Richard, though the child was actually nearly 4 and was really named Jerry. The sisters theorized that Isabel herself, or someone she'd enlisted, was the woman who approached Jerry with candy that afternoon. Isabel matched the psychological profile that police had recognized since the 1920s, an older woman, unable to conceive, under pressure to produce an heir, who resorts to taking someone else's child. Fass noted it was unusual that the victim wasn't an infant, since women in these situations typically sought newborns so husbands would more easily accept the child as biologically theirs. But Angelo had been gone 2 years and had never seen his supposed newborn, so when he returned to find a child his wife identified as his 2-year-old son, he had no basis for doubt, since that was all the information he had. Whether Angelo was truly deceived or quietly complicit remains unknown, with no one left alive to answer that question. The sisters attempted to locate physical evidence. Cynthia's brother-in-law, who worked in law enforcement, searched for the original case file with the NYPD but found nothing, likely destroyed in the earlier precinct fire, along with Tommy's original statement and any investigative records. The old newspaper clipping from the New York Daily News became the strongest surviving proof that the abduction and subsequent investigation had actually taken place. Legally speaking, there was no surviving documentation and no living witnesses, but there was another kind of evidence, one without legal standing but compelling to the family nonetheless. Comparing photographs, the sisters noticed striking physical resemblance between Tommy and Richard, similar facial structure, similar eyes, and when they finally met Tommy in person at Thanksgiving 2019 in Florida, the resemblance extended beyond looks. Both men shared a love of coconut cake, and both had once dreamed of acting, with Tommy having kept old headshots from his youthful aspirations, a passion Richard had also independently pursued. Their temperaments mirrored each other closely, humorous and warm, but also carrying underlying anxiety. Cynthia recalled her father as gentle, funny, playfully silly, and someone who'd always wanted to act but never pursued it professionally, and Uncle Tommy shared these exact traits. None of this constituted legal proof, of course. No court would weigh a shared fondness for coconut cake as evidence. But for Audrey and Cynthia, sitting across from a 79-year-old man whose smile mirrored their father's so precisely, this felt more convincing than any statistical DNA match. Everything aligned: genetics, timing, physical resemblance, tastes, and personality. One question remained unanswered, though: who would be held accountable when everyone with knowledge of the truth had already died? Typically, even decades-old cases eventually reach some resolution before a court. Jerry Martin's case never did. Isabel Palladieso, the primary suspect, died when Richard was just 12, never questioned about the abduction or the falsified birth date. Angelo, who either was deceived or silently complicit, died when Richard was 27, carrying any answers with him. Helen Hahn, the babysitter the family claimed was Richard's real mother, died when the twins were only 10. Harold Martin, Jerry's biological father, who spent years pleading for updates from police, died still believing his son was alive, never knowing he'd been right all along. Nancy, wrongly suspected by investigators of taking her own child, died without ever being fully exonerated in the public record. And Richard Jerry himself died in 2017, 2 years before his daughters uncovered his true identity. With the original police file destroyed by fire, everyone who might have explained what happened on July 9, 1945, was gone. There was never a trial, a verdict, or any official resolution. The woman who took Jerry that day was never identified, whether Isabel herself, someone she hired, or a participant in a black market adoption scheme. No one was ever held responsible or asked to explain their actions. Many questions remain permanently unresolved. Did Isabel commit the abduction personally or arrange for someone else to do it? Was Angelo aware of the deception, or genuinely unaware his entire life? What was Helen Hand's actual role and relationship to the family? Did Richard ever experience fragmented memories of his earlier life, flashes of a bicycle, a different name being called out, an unfamiliar loud neighborhood, that he dismissed as meaningless dreams? Could his lifelong bipolar disorder and anxiety trace back to unconscious trauma from the abduction, something his mind buried but his body still carried? Some mysteries simply have no resolution, and often that uncertainty is more painful than the original events themselves. At Thanksgiving 2019, Audrey and Cynthia traveled to Florida to meet Tommy Martin for the first time. When the elderly man saw them approaching, he recognized in their faces the brother he'd lost in 1945, not the young boy he remembered, but an adult version of those same features, reflected now in nieces he never knew existed. Tommy shared memories of their childhood, the bikes on the sidewalk, that summer afternoon, the stranger with candy, and the 74 years he'd carried this loss. He never had children of his own and had lived his whole life alone with that memory. Afterward, his half-sister Mary gave him framed photographs from the reunion as a Father's Day gift, marking the first time in his life, at 79, that he had a family of his own. Audrey later reflected that while it was painful they hadn't discovered the connection in time for Tommy and Richard to reunite while both were alive, she found comfort knowing her father had ultimately been loved, and believed he was now reunited with his biological parents in some way. For the sisters, learning the truth didn't just introduce them to new relatives, it helped them finally understand their father in ways they couldn't while he was alive. Cynthia noted that despite being close to him and finding him kind, there had always been an inexplicable emotional distance that now made more sense. Conversations with Palladesa relatives revealed that Richard had been raised in a strict, cold environment and had been anxious and withdrawn even as a child, traits that persisted into adulthood alongside his bipolar disorder. All of this took on new significance once viewed through the lens of his hidden past. Yet this understanding also introduced fresh sorrow. Richard had missed out on a relationship with Tommy and Mary, siblings who might have loved him without the coldness he experienced from the Palladesa family. It also finally explained why that family had kept Richard and his own family at arm's length for decades. They'd always known he wasn't biologically theirs, and that unspoken secret created a distance Richard felt but never understood. The Jerry Martin case didn't lead to new legislation, inspire any advocacy organization, or become the basis of a long-running TV series, nor did it contribute to locating any of the hundreds of thousands of other missing children cases. But it did demonstrate, undeniably, the transformative power of modern DNA technology. A DNA kit priced at only a few $dozen, purchased online and processed at a lab in California, accomplished something an entire police department with thousands of officers had failed to do across 74 years. The case raises a broader question for society: how many similar hidden cases still exist? How many people are unknowingly living under identities that aren't truly theirs? How many families continue searching for missing loved ones who might actually be living nearby under different names? Modern DNA technology is gradually unraveling crimes from the previous century, one genetic sample at a time. Following their initial reunion in Florida, Tommy, Mary, Audrey, Cynthia, and Stephanie developed an ongoing relationship, staying connected through calls, texts, and social media. The sisters shared stories about Richard as an adult, his love of film, his sense of humor, his marriage, his daughters, essentially his whole life lived without awareness of his true identity. In turn, Tommy offered memories from before the abduction, recollections of Jerry as a small child, along with what Harold had said about his youngest son and the grief he'd carried for decades. Together, both branches of the family assembled a complete picture that neither side could have formed alone. Jerry as a boy, through Tommy's memories, and Richard as a grown man, through his daughter's recollections, finally piecing together one continuous life, from a child riding bikes in Hell's Kitchen to a man who died at 76 on the East Coast, a life divided by a single afternoon in July 1945 and eventually reunited, 74 years later, in memory if not in person. Harold Martin had insisted throughout his life, even from his deathbed, that Jerry was still alive, a belief no one accepted, yet one that ultimately proved accurate. Jerry lived to 76, married, raised 3 daughters, and had grandchildren. Harold had been right all along, though he died without ever knowing it. The identity of the woman who approached Jerry that July afternoon in 1945 will likely never be known. Whether Richard ever experienced fragmentary dreams or memories of an earlier life, bicycles, an older brother, a different setting, that he dismissed upon waking will also never be known. Had the truth surfaced while everyone involved was alive, the brothers might have reunited, and Harold might have seen his son again before dying. But the extended Palladieso family, aware all along that Richard wasn't biologically theirs, never disclosed it, and Richard died without ever knowing there was a question worth asking. Jerry Martin's story didn't result in new legislation or inspire a media franchise, nor did it reform any legal systems. But it illustrated that an entire identity can be stolen through deception just as thoroughly as through death. His name, birth date, family, and true self were replaced by a fabricated version he unknowingly carried for 76 years. It also demonstrated that truth can eventually surface despite decades of concealment, falsified documents, family silence, and destroyed records, undone ultimately by a single DNA sample. Tommy Martin, now 79, finally understood that his brother hadn't vanished entirely. He had lived a full, if different, life. And Tommy's newfound nieces now consider him family, sharing memories of the father who was simultaneously Jerry and Richard. The case offers several takeaways relevant to any family. First, consider DNA testing if searching for a missing relative or questioning your origins. Platforms like 23andMe or AncestryDNA can occasionally succeed where traditional investigation fails, as demonstrated by Tommy's discovery at age 79. Second, never leave children unattended around strangers, even briefly or in seemingly safe environments. Jerry was taken in broad daylight, in a close-knit neighborhood, through nothing more than an offer of candy, underscoring the importance of teaching children early not to approach or go with unfamiliar adults. Third, be honest with family members. The Palladieso family's decades of silence about Richard's origins didn't protect anyone. It only prevented him from ever knowing his biological family or reuniting with his brother, and prevented Harold from potentially seeing his son again before death. Secrets like this don't shield people, they confine them. Fourth, don't give up hope. Harold searched until his death, and Tommy continued for decades. Anyone with a missing loved one should consider registering with relevant national missing persons databases and submitting DNA, since today's tools can resolve cases that once seemed permanently unsolvable. Finally, identity extends beyond legal documentation. It encompasses family, history, and origin, and having that identity taken away, even unknowingly, can leave lasting effects throughout a person's life. If you find this story meaningful, please hit subscribe and share the video so more people can learn about real cases that changed the lives of entire families. Thank you for watching. See you in the next.